Well, hello. My name is Gary Davis, and I'm going to share with you today a couple of reflections about some of the things I've learned about ethics in 30 years of teaching ethics with students from a variety of fields and at a variety of levels in their higher education. Ethics is a term that comes from the Greek meaning custom. Morality has the same root. More is a word we still use to describe the customs of a society. So if you look at the etymological side of the terms ethics and morality, what we're talking about are the ways that people function. We say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And that's an admission that different people in different societies have different moral codes or ethical codes. And the maxim of when in Rome, do as the Romans do tells us to study the culture of which we're a part, learn its ways, and adapt to those ways. That's not bad advice, although sometimes there's need to suggest changes. When I was still in graduate school and my wife was teaching elementary school in a recently integrated school system in North Carolina, she became aware of the fact that students had birthday parties and they invited all the other members of the class to the birthday party, except there was the custom in those days, this was the 1960s, of not inviting people of other races. In her particular case, she had a class with only one African-American student, and that African-American student wasn't being invited to the birthday parties of her classmates. One of the mothers of one of the other classmates tried to explain to my wife that this was just the way we do things here. And my wife, I think, wisely took the opportunity to speak up and say, well, maybe this is one of the standards of the community that ought to be revisited now that the laws have changed. Maybe we ought to take another look, and maybe there's another way of doing these things. So adjusting to the culture of which you're a part is always a good starting point. Knowing when to suggest changes, that's a good starting. That's an additional good starting point in our conversation here today. There are some people who think that if they do the right thing, then there's nothing to be feared. The world will fall at their feet, and they will be universally applauded and lauded and recognized for their moral achievement. These are people that haven't made very many significant ethical decisions in their lifetimes, because once you start standing up for things in which you believe, you'll soon find that, as Claire Booth Luce, that was her name, one of the publishers of Time magazine, said that no good deed goes unpunished. And Claire Booth Luce was right about that. Sometimes we have to be prepared to pay a price for the personal ethical stands we make. Just want to be sure we all understand that at the outset. Now, Joseph Badaracco, who teaches business ethics at the Harvard School of Business, says that there are ways to mitigate the negative effects of an ethical call, an ethical decision. He wrote a book about this called Leading Quietly, where he talked to people who had made such decisions and who had found ways using time and sometimes creative approaches. He found that some people were able to make ethical decisions and not pay a fatal price, at least, for the decisions that they made. Sometimes, of course, the decision is fatal, and I want everybody to be aware of that. We're talking about something, when we talk about ethics, we're talking about something that sometimes has very serious consequences, and you have to have this is the time to have the conversation with yourself. How far am I willing to go to stand up for what is right? Would I be willing to be fired for this kind of decision or that kind of decision? It's a lot easier to make the decision when the decision actually has to be made if you've had an opportunity to think through some of these things ahead of time, and that's the purpose of this video today. One of the most challenging things about ethical decision making is the fact that it's not always a matter of right versus wrong. When it's right versus wrong, It's a little easier, at least you know which way you should be heading. It doesn't make the consequences, facing the consequences of an ethical decision, any easier. We've already mentioned that. But at least you know what's the right thing to do happens to be in this particular case. There are other cases where you'll be challenged with a right versus right decision. Rushworth Kidder, in his books, talks about right versus right, and he lays out 4 different kinds of ethical dilemmas that I'd like to share with you today. These ethical dilemmas, once you realize what they are, and once you realize which directions you happen to be more comfortable with in general on these ethical dilemmas, the easier it will be for you to give yourself some time to give both sides of the dilemma adequate consideration before making your decision. And that's the secret. No matter which kind of call you make, you'll be faulted for not honoring the opposite value. But you'll be able to say to yourself, but I did consider that opposite value, and I took it into consideration very carefully in making my final decision. So you can live with ethical decisions better if you've had a chance to plot them out carefully. And these dilemmas I'm laying out today for you so that you'll be able to do that. The first set of equal rights, equally right things, is justice versus mercy. Now, we can say all kinds of good things about justice, and we can say all kinds of good things about mercy. Nothing bad can really be said about mercy. Nothing bad can be said about justice. But what about a situation where you have to make a call and it involves justice versus mercy? An example I sometimes use, it's a simple example, but it makes the point, is a mother who has laid down a curfew for her daughter to encourage responsible behavior. She said to her daughter, okay, from now on, if you miss curfew, you're grounded for 2 weeks. And sure enough, just 1 week before the prom, the biggest event of the year for the daughter comes home 10 minutes late one evening. So the mother has to decide, okay, am I going to go with justice, lay down the law, enforce the 2-week grounding, or am I going to cut her some slack on this particular occasion because it's so important and because she was only 10 minutes late? Do I act honoring the value of mercy predominantly, and we'll just park justice for the afternoon and not let it hold sway in this decision? No matter which way you go, you're going to be faulted, and you'll fault yourself. If you go in the direction of mercy, maybe you will have given up or sacrificed a chance to make a point that your daughter really needs to absorb, namely that rules have consequences. Rules are important, and breaking rules, that's what has consequences. If you go in the direction of justice, you've made that point, but you have maybe done some permanent damage to the relationship you have with your daughter, and this might not augur well for the future. So was that really a wise and prudent decision? Maybe you should have cut her some slack. Maybe justice should have been the prevailing value. It's up to you, justice versus mercy. A second right versus right dilemma set is the one that involves truth-telling versus loyalty. In the Penn State scandal involving Coach Paterno recently, we all saw an organization that was dominated by a sense of loyalty, so that when the truth needed to be told, it wasn't told. And we saw the terrible consequences of that. In that case, in retrospect, it's a lot easier to say truth-telling deserved more attention as a value than it got. But in situations that you will face, you'll have to decide, okay, do I keep this to myself? If I've seen standards of the company being abused, or maybe even the laws of the state in which we're functioning or the nation in which we're functioning violated, do I keep that to myself, or do I bring it forward for public consumption? Is it right to be a truth teller? Yes, but not always, because sometimes loyalty is the more sensible course. Maybe something can be worked out. Maybe the situation can be mitigated without doing a lot of damage to a lot of people and applying a lot of sometimes draconian penalties. So maybe discretion would be the better course than simply telling all that I know about the situation. Truth-telling versus loyalty, it's your choice. The third right versus right set is the community versus the individual. One of my favorite movies is U-571, which is about a submariner or submariner, the Navy I guess says, who isn't given his command of a submarine because his captain says he's not able to sacrifice, he's not mature enough yet to be able to sacrifice some of his troops for the sake of the others. And about half an hour into the movie, for reasons that we don't need to get into here, he does have his command, and he is in the Atlantic, and he is in a skirmish with the enemy, and he does need to take the boat down and save his crew and sacrifice 2 or 3 of his people who are still in the water. Interestingly enough, one of them who's in the water and could be sacrificed is the captain, who told him that he didn't have enough courage or maturity to do the right thing in a situation like that. He takes the boat down and the crew is saved, but those in the water are drowned, including the captain. What would you do in a situation like that? If you were in an organization that had a person who was struggling in his position, say he's new or she's new, and she's not really a good fit initially at least, but has potential for developing, are you going to let the organization suffer the consequences of his or her poor performance? Or are you just going to dump her and save the organization? I've been in situations like that, and it's hard sometimes you have to have a conversation with yourself. You have to decide, okay, how much can the organization withstand, and how much potential does this individual have? Maybe the person has a great deal of potential, but is doing so much damage to the organization that it's clearly the right thing to do to save the community at the cost to the individual. Individual versus community. Are you an individual? Do you lean toward protecting the interests of the community, or do you lean toward protecting the interests of individuals within the community? That's up to you to decide. And the fourth dilemma set that I'm going to share with you today is now versus later. I work with a lot of not-for-profit organizations that have tremendous reserves, and they have current problems that could easily be solved by applying some of those reserves, but they're so focused on the future and being prepared for the future that the problems of today seem relatively inconsequential. Maybe they're more consequential than they are being perceived to be. Maybe some of the concern for the future is misplaced. On the other hand, we all know the grasshopper and ant story, and we know what happens when you don't think about the future and only think about the present. Sometimes present needs and present opportunities are loom larger than they should in the decision-making process. So, are you the kind of person who is constantly, are you an ant or a grasshopper? Are you preparing for the future the way the ant was, or are you enjoying the day the way the grasshopper was? It's up to you to decide. And we can't fault your decision. My suggestion is that you go through these 4 dilemmas and determine what kind of person you are. In my own case, for example, when it comes to justice versus mercy, I tend to be a mercy person. I like to cut people some slack, and it doesn't bother me to bend or break the laws when necessary. In terms of truth-telling versus loyalty, for whatever reasons, I'm a truth-teller, basically. I tend to want to get the truth out on the table, even maybe sometimes when I shouldn't. In terms of community versus individual, more interested probably in the community than the fate of the individual, willing to sacrifice the individual for the sake of community in a number of cases, and maybe I'm more inclined toward the community than I am toward the individual. And finally, now versus later, definitely now. Not a later kind of person. It's hard for me to envision the future or to know how the future will play out, so I'm more inclined to solve the problem of the day. Now, knowing that I am a mercy person, that I am a community person, that I am a truth-telling person, and that I am a now person, helps me, when I'm facing an ethical dilemma, force myself to give the opposite ends of those dilemmas adequate consideration. Am I really being fair to the needs of justice? Am I really being fair to the needs of the individual? Am I really being fair to the needs of the of the other end of the spectrum, the one that doesn't come naturally to me. And that would also, of course, include the future. And it would also include each of the ends of the spectrum that just doesn't come naturally to me. Are they all being given adequate consideration in my final decision making? If not, then I haven't done my homework and I haven't prepared myself for the ethical calls that I have to make. I'd encourage you to ask yourself whether you are a justice person or a mercy person by nature, or maybe it's by nurture. I'm not sure whether you were born this way or whether you were made this way by your upbringing, but in terms of justice versus mercy, to which end of that ethical dilemma set do you incline? When it comes to truth-telling versus loyalty, which is it that has the upper hand for you? Community versus individual, which naturally comes to mind in a ethically freighted situation? And now versus future, are you an ant or are you a grasshopper? Once you find out what kind of person you are, then make sure you give adequate and full consideration to the opposite value in making your decision. And then you'll be able to live with the consequences of your decision. When you're faulted for not giving adequate consideration to justice and the needs of justice, you can say, but I did. I took Gary Davis's advice and I considered both ends of the dilemma, especially the one that doesn't come naturally to me, before I made my final call. And you'll rest easier with your decision having approached ethical decision making in that manner. Good luck in the ethical decisions that await you.